systems. We have 4 interesting presentations that will be happening today. And we'll jump right in, starting with Richard Arnold from Muskingum University with the spread of Russia's Cossack movement.
So can you hear me okay? So thank you for that introduction, Sarah, and thank you for having me to speak today. The topic of my presentation is on the Cossacks, who have become a feature of Russian politics. We'll go more into the ways in which they influence the Russian politics society. For my questions today, where did the service Cossack movement come? When did it arise? How did it gain in popularity? And what does the increasing popularity of the movement augur for the future? So a little bit of my argument is that the movement spread from the south of the country to the rest of the country, and it's received really great attention in Putin's third term. It existed as a social movement in post-Soviet Russia for a while, but it's only since Putin's third term has it really taken on significant visibility. So before I go too deep into the presentation, there are a few key terms we need to define, and that is the distinction between free and service Cossacks. In Russia, there's a distinction between free Cossacks, those who claim Cossack ancestry and claim to be Cossacks by din of birth. Estimates are there are around 7 million such Cossacks in Eurasia, and service Cossacks, or those who have merited the title by signing up for the state registry and doing things for the state. The service Cossacks are organized, so there's the free Cossacks are organized through they're loosely affiliated through a website. In the service Cossacks are pictured in 12 hosts throughout the country, the Kuban, Don, Terek, Volga, and other Cossack hosts. These hosts are not identical with nor conform to other administrative structures in Russia. However, they do exist in 75 regions. The first big moment we need to talk about is the creation. In 1990, some of these Cossack movements revived and they met in Moscow, talking about how to revive the Cossacks. And they set up a loose structure. It was pressure from below which created a registry in 1995 where Cossacks could formally serve the state. And that state service took different forms, including participating in the military, participating in some of the regions in Chechnya, protecting ethnic Russians. In 2014, the Kuban Cossacks played an important role in the annexation of Crimea. This is directly referred to on the website of the organization I'm about to talk about. And now they function as a military reserve for Russian forces. In the current war, we have in fact seen some reports of Cossack deaths. The young man pictured at the top there died in combat in Ukraine on February 28th. Cossacks also engage in movements which are supporting Russian troops, including forming a giant Z at the base of one of the fortresses in Crimea. As I mentioned, there are 170,000 registered Cossacks. In 2018, however, they underwent a further reorganization, a further centralization with the creation of the All-Russian Cossack Organization. In 2018, this was a structure which superimposed itself upon at the time there were 11 hosts, the 12th host, the Black Sea Cossack host, was added in 2019. And the ataman of the VSKO. The ataman is a term used to describe the Cossack chieftain. The ataman of the VSKO was a guy called Nikolay Deluna. There is significant evidence, in my opinion, that he was aware of plans to invade Ukraine, including articles that came out on the VSKO website before the invasion, 2 or 3 days before the invasion, saying we must once again prepare ourselves to serve the motherland in ways we have never served before. So I wanted to demonstrate this idea of looking at seeing when Cossacks became a really great sign of significance in Russian society. So using the lens, I drew up a measure of salience showing academic works and focused on the Cossacks, and you see a real jump in the attention given to Cossackdom. I think the word used was Kazakhstan. A real jump in attention given to the Cossacks around about 2010, between 2010 and 2012. I broke this down by region, furthermore, to see, and this is part of an ongoing project that I have planned for next year on my sabbatical leave. But this, I broke them down by region to see the salience of particular hosts. And as you can see there, it seems like most of the hosts gained attention at the same time. So all of them gained equally. I then looked for two measures, two ways of understanding the geographical spread of the Cossack. How can we measure where the Cossacks are moving to? And one institution, the Cossacks perform three functions for the Russian state. First of all, they provide patriotic training of youth. This is principally through the Cossack Cadet Corps, though increasingly through other educational institutions as well. I'll talk more about that in a minute. The other way is through patrols and maintaining security in Russian cities. Maybe some of you have seen the patrols of Cossacks taking over the streets and harassing migrants. And the third way is fighting ecological problems, spontaneous ecological problems like putting out forest fires and in tackling the effects of global warming. So to look at, the geographical spread, I looked at first mention of Cossack Cadet Corps in regions. Thank you. And these cadet corps focus on paramilitary training. You have children in the picture who look absurdly young to be practicing military drills, but that's the reality. These camps also with rifle shooting, training in basic weapons, maintenance, and the like. They teach Cossack history and patriotism. They teach values which come to respect fatherland. They're a very ultra-patriotic organization, as well as proficiency with arms. A great emphasis on preparation for military service, and they're an extracurricular organization, somewhat like the Scouts, but as one of my interviewees in 2016 told me, they're more like the Hitlerjugend. Take that for what it's worth. I can't comment on that, beyond what you told me. In Rostov, I forgot to put the year, but in Rostov, currently there are 622 institutions with over 100,000 students. It's a very competitive process to get into. The Cossack Cadet Corps. And you can see the geographical spread in the table, beginning in Kuban, Don, and Terek regions, spreading to Zabaikalsky, Orenburg, the Far Eastern. They also have, and I can talk more about this in the Q&A if you like, but there's also Cossack organizations in the DNR and LNR, the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic, separatist regions of Moscow, So another way I looked at measuring the geographical spread was looking at the first mention, and these mentions all come from Cossack websites. So I haven't yet expanded the analysis to the Eastview Eastview newspaper data set, but these all come from Cossack websites. Thank you. And once again, these Druzhiny patrols, these groups of men who dress up like Cossacks and parade around the streets in uniforms, who sometimes looked at as being ryazhny or clownish. The dates of the first patrol are given in the table here. I think it's organized not by region, but by chronology. So granted, there have been, these were the dates in which they were first formally integrated into governmental structures. There have been a history of providing volunteer security, particularly in Krasnodar, where Cossacks patrol the Meskhetian Turk community. So my last slide. This is a picture of Nikolay Deluna. This is the All-Russian Cossack Society. The implications are that they're actively being used in the war. They provide a security and military service as well as actual fighting. This newish VSKO has a centralized structure. I do want to suggest that the Kremlin is playing with fire by commandeering this Cossack legacy in the manner that it has. There are Cossack nationalists in the movie who, in Russia who are unhappy at the commandeering of the movement. But most importantly, there are means of consolidating gains in eastern Ukraine, setting up Cossack government-organized non-governmental organizations, like in the LNR and Crimea. They are further evidence of the 19th century conception of the Russian nation state and relevant to the topic of this panel. I wonder if this suggests the increasing popularity of elites from the south. And with that, I'm out of time, so thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So next up, we have Kirill Melnikov from the Institute of Philosophy and Law at the Ural branch of the Russian Academy of Sciences in Yekaterinburg, Russia, and also a Fulbright Scholar, I believe. Yes. So you should be able to pull your slides up there. And I'll give you 3 minutes and 1 minute. Warning without. On the side.
Yeah. Thank you very much for hosting this panel, and that's a great pleasure and great responsibility to share table with such bright scholars. So my topic is the newborn concept, the unified system of public power. The 2020 constitutional amendments not only granted Vladimir Putin with the right to run for 2 more presidential terms, but one of the most controversial ideas consisted of the jure elimination of independence of self-governance from the regional and the federal layers of power, which granted by Article 12 of the Russian Constitution. In order to circumvent the protected status of the first chapter of the Constitution, the Kremlin put forth a new concept, the unified system of public power, and put it in the 8th chamber of the charter of the Constitution. So what attracted public attention with this new law is twofold. First, the prohibition for regions to use term president in namings of their head executives, which mainly concerns just one region in Russia, Tatarstan. And surprisingly, 6 deputies of United Russia in State Duma refused to approve this bill, and all of them were from Tatarstan. So the second idea that attracted public attention was the elimination of term limits for governors, which would allow re-elections of governors in such crucial regions of Russia as Moscow Oblast, Chechnya, Tatarstan, and 18 more. But 200 pages bill contains a lot of institutional provisions that would redefine the federalist relations in Russia. And these provisions can be roughly grouped into 2 baskets. The first is the redefinition of relations between federal center and regions, and between regions and local authorities, which is a vertical dimension, institutional dimension. And the horizontal dimension is the relations between governors and regional assemblies. So just several points, few innovations. First of all, the new law expanded the grounds on which the president of Russia can dismiss a governor. So the loss of confidence, the president had this tool, but it had its limitations. So the president would need to argue that corruption crime happened, or the governor used financial tools when he or she was running for office. The new law actually relieved the president from the burden of proof that any of these things happened. So the second is the institute of reprimand. So the president can issue a reprimand to governor for simply poor performance. Then regional prosecutors received the right of legislative initiative in the regional assemblies. And governors also lost their discretion to appoint key ministers in the regions. So in order to appoint ministers in healthcare, education, housing, and finance, the governor would need to enlist support of federal ministry. So regarding horizontal dimension, first of all, the president and governor retains the right to warn and dismiss regional parliaments.
The regional parliaments lost their power to define the structure of regional governments. What caused the main disappointment of the leading opposition party in Russia, KPRF, was the elimination of minimal threshold for party list voting, which were actually 25%. The previous law granted 25% as party voting lists. And also, this new law equated regional deputies with civil servants, with accompanying restrictions on running business, having bank accounts. It's not relevant anymore, but still. Well, what is the reason behind these new provisions? So the simple answer is, well, that's just another step in centralization in Russia. But in order to estimate this argument, first of all, let's estimate the status quo regarding centralization. So any autonomy of regions contains two separate dimensions. First is budgetary autonomy, and the second is political autonomy. When we're talking about budgetary autonomy, first of all, what needed to be said, that there are only 13 Russian regions that has status of donors. So they don't receive equalization grants. And if we take the data from the federal treasury, we can see that, well, in Ossetia and Chechnya, not surprisingly, 90% of their budget revenues comes from the federal budget. But the median region, which is like Tomsk Oblast, so 40% of their revenues comes from the federal budget. And that's only two minor signs of dependence of regions on the federal budget. So the situation is the same for cities and villages. We have only 250 municipal divisions that didn't receive grants from regions to cover their expenses. So local level also stripped of the budgetary tools to sustain their autonomy. When we talk about political autonomy, we can also see that only 4 governors out of more than 150 defeated pre-appointed governor in the elections. The same is true for local level. So we can see that the trend of declining number of elected mayors on the local level. So the data shows that, first of all, is there any room for further centralization in Russia? And the second, the law doesn't actually provide any new redistribution of autonomies in regions or in localities. But underlying trends, in my point of view, is threefold. First, that's formalization of already existing informal practices and codifying the scattered norms, uplifting their status to the federal status. A second is extension of presidential discretionary powers. And the third is response to residual failures of the system. Thank you. Just one example. I can explain maybe a little bit in detail in Q&A session, but regarding dismissal due to loss of confidence. So if you take a look at the 2 most previous cases when the president issued decree on the dismissal due to loss of confidence was, first of all, Sergei Furgal case in Khabarovsk 2020 and Mikhail Ignatiev case in Chuvash Republic 2020. And both cases ended up in quite severe conflicts. So probably everyone knows about Khabarovsk protest sparked by the dismissal that became the most biggest. I will wrap it up. The biggest protest in Russia in Khabarovsk for its history. But the second case, which is less known, actually motivated Mikhail Ignatiev to sue President Putin and to file a lawsuit in the Supreme Court of Russia, which actually issued a symbolic challenge to the Putin's image, which is dependent upon superiority over other politicians in Russia. So in order to avoid this, now the president doesn't need to prove that any grounds for dismissal happened. Yeah, that's purely discretional power right now. So yeah, I will skip all the other examples. This system comes at cost as well, because now we can see that informal hierarchy and formal hierarchy became detached from each other, and actually this can cause that Kremlin would lose its grip on the regional politics, just the opposite that a unified system of public power intended to achieve. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So next we have Gulnaz Sharafutdinova from King's College, London, and we'll be presenting Can Religious Authorities Help with COVID-19 Vaccination? I hope so. Lessons from Muslims in Tatarstan.
Yes, hello everyone. So I will present to you the results of a pilot research that was done over the fall of 2021 on the back of my trip to Tatarstan in summer 2021. And in the world when the issues of public health related to the pandemic and the challenge of vaccination as a response to the pandemic was the priority for the governments. So many researchers and many opinion surveys in various countries have highlighted that frequently vaccine hesitancy is linked to government trust, to the level of government trust, that you frequently see more hesitant individuals also trusting the government less, right? So this widespread understanding led me on the path of thinking whether the governments can rely on other sorts of non-state social authorities to confront this challenge of vaccination, right? If the public health issue is responded through vaccination, can it be done by using, for example, Orthodox Church or in Tatarstan, Muslim authorities, right? So I came with it to this project with rather little knowledge of how religious authorities operate, how in fact, preaching occurs in the mosques. So I came with an open mind to see whether there are any chances that, say, the Tatarstan's government, which has shown itself to be quite capable on various issues linked to modernization, industrial development, etc., can it, if people do not trust the government on the issues of vaccination, can, for example, they use their relationships with the mosque leaders, with religious authorities, right? And another important motivation for studying was observations from other countries where skeptical minorities, frequently religious or ethnic, were attended to by the government coming to, let's say, rabbis in Israel and co-opting them into the task of vaccinating the Orthodox Jews. The same happened in Germany with Lutheran pastors who were creating vaccination posts within churches, etc. So around the world, there are cases where non-state authorities are part of the vaccination effort, okay? Now, to add to this, for the Republic of Tatarstan, we also see a rather concrete linkages that make public health issues close to issues of religion. So in Tatarstan, for example, the issues of halal consumption has been growing, and we see growth of halal cafes and restaurants and food consumption. And furthermore, more recently, we saw a direction of development towards creating halal or religiously appropriate hospitals, clinics for treating Muslims, right? So that gives you an additional aspect of connection between religion and health issues that again gives this idea, okay, where could religious authorities be used by the state? So the study was done based on in-depth interviews that involved several experts on religion in Tatarstan, as well as at least 3 members of the some top layers in the administrative hierarchy of Islamic institutions in Tatarstan, and also just ordinary Muslims who are attending mosques, and one imam from the village. So I wouldn't say there is a very sort of huge end to this study, but it did bring me to the point of understanding the main trends and allows me to sort of offer you at least some conclusions and potentially the reasons behind these outcomes. Okay. So one point about, let me bring up the institutional basis of Muslim governance in Russia. It enables a high degree of decentralization and fragmentation of Islamic authority across Russia. So the Muslims of Tatarstan are represented through the spiritual board of the Dum RT, the spiritual board of the Muslims in the Republic of Tatarstan. And presently, imams in the villages have regular and rather hierarchical relationships with state authorities on the ground. So there are regular meetings that village imams have with specific state officials who are responsible for supervising interconfessional and interethnic relationships, right? So there is sort of a potential, institutional potential for how the impulse on policy from the top could be transferred to the bottom, right? Now, my quick response to what my findings are is that the effective reliance on religious authorities did not happen in Tatarstan. And there are probably a few reasons that we could cite. And so while on the ground, we do not see a consistent message, pro-vaccination message in the mosques, although all the hygienic mask wearing and social distancing issues were considered and were implemented, but at a more systemic level, the message for vaccination on the ground did not happen, right? However, we do notice that there was a pressure from the state on the top religious authorities to allow for the quote-unquote halalness of the vaccine, right? So there were official statements and fatwas and certifications that certified at least 2 Russian vaccines to be halal for Muslims. And there were cases when, say, Mufti of Tatarstan, Kamil Semigulin, was publicized with his photos of having vaccinated, right? And from my interviews, I understand that, yes, the Kamil Hazrat Semigulin is actually a very private man and usually doesn't prefer such public statements, etc., which leads these experts and observers to suggest that probably there was some pressure from the top hierarchies of the government to show leadership. Right now, the question is, why doesn't this leadership come on the bottom ground, on the ground level? There is no sort of mechanisms for transferring that impulse, that pressure to the bottom levels. And the only thing that I would offer as one of the potential explanations is the type of relationships between the state and the mosques that is there at play in Russia. And that's not only about Islamic religion, but also about Orthodox Church. And that relationship is extremely hierarchical. So instead of treating these non-state actors as having their own agency, their own reputation, and their own say, they are given orders from the top, right? And they can show the symbolic images from the top, but that message doesn't quite get to the bottom. And the only policy suggestion about when such non-state actors could be used is when more equal, respect-based relationships are created between such non-state religious authorities and the state and the government. And this, to my understanding from comparative studies of how religion gets used in other countries, this is one of the observations that fits other national realities as well. Thank you for your attention.
And our last presenter today is Maria Snegovaya from George Washington University, a presentation prepared with Nikolay Petrov of Chatham House.
Small corrections, actually Kirill Petrov. Sorry, I didn't know here before.
Ah, okay, yes, it says Nikolay. Kirill Petrov. With the Nomenklatura, origins of Putinite elites.
Yes, thank you so much, everybody, and apologies, Nikolay Petrov is a great scholar as well.
I think that's why somebody made the like subliminal. I was like, oh, Nikolay Petrov. I didn't know he was at Chatham House, but
Yeah. All right. So thank you very much, everybody. This article has just been accepted by Soviet Affairs, but at the same time, it's my first time presenting, so apologies for any issues. Until recently, studies of Putin's elites in post-Soviet Russia have been focusing on several dimensions. At first, in early 1990s, there was a significant amount of studies devoted to the role of continuity between the Soviet and Russian elites, and many studies have found that there was a significant degree of continuity. As a matter of fact, you did not see a lot of rotation in post-Soviet elites early on after transition. However, this line stream of literature has mostly been abandoned in 2000s, when the main focus of scholarship refocused on Putin's regime security origin, where again it's been discovered that between 20 and 30%, at least by late 2000s, of Putin elite groups constituted of the sample that scholars used, constituted security, those with security service background. Last but not the least, there's also a track that focuses on business career and oligarchs' origin. Now, in this work specifically, we suggest to bring the focus back to nomenklatura background. And who do we mean when we talk about nomenklatura? We talk specifically of the lists of positions and offices in a Soviet system which required approval by the Central Committee of the Communist Party. It's essentially a Soviet managerial class. This concept was originally introduced, among others, by Michael Vaslensky, and he estimated that in late Soviet Union, this group of people constituted from 750,000 to 3 million of people, or 1 to 3% of the population. Fairly narrow group, if you look at the Soviet Union broadly. Now, why 30 years after transition shall we care about this question? Well, as a matter of fact, multiple studies have demonstrated that elite backgrounds matter for what they do, for their attitudes, values, policy preferences. In Russia in particular, studies also show that parental education and the social background tends to condition children's values and preferences. And we actually want to know what conditions, values, and preferences and policy choices of Putin's elites. We also definitely see that nomenklatura conditioned the backgrounds and also policy and attitudes of the kids of nomenklatura during the USSR period. Vaslensky provides evidence for it. Last but not the least, if we do discover significant degree of continuity in to nomenclature among Putin elites today, 30 years after the transition, that tells us something, I suspect, about the autocratic trends within Putin's Russia. Now, how did we do it? We actually looked not just at individual career backgrounds in late Soviet Union and tried to identify how many of Putin's elites, the top 100 Putin elites, have those links, but also looked at the family backgrounds. Our assumption here is that it's been 30 years, right? It's over one generation, as a matter of fact. So it's possible that some of people in Putin's elite were too young at the time to have any meaningful nomenclature career track in late Soviet Union, but they still link to nomenclature for their parental backgrounds. So our approach is both looking at individual career tracks. We don't find any links to nomenclature there. We also looked at the parental backgrounds to see if there is any continuity. And we looked, first of all, at the more conservative estimate, top Politburo sort of type of people, connections. So if you had any parents or you personally had anything to do with very high level positions in the system, but also a less conservative estimate looking at middle to lower nomenclature ranks. This is generally a connection to the managerial class. Here we follow methodology proposed by Rigby. And of course, if there was no any connection, then we assign the values here. There's also, we look at 2010 and 2020 for comparative purposes, use two methods. The first one is positional. It's just essentially formal formal group of the elites based on their formal positions. Here are the positions that we have identified. Everything is available for you to read. We have preprint posted as SRN. The other sample is reputational. Here we looked at the top 100 list. Top 100 list of Putin's most influential elites that's compiled yearly by Независимая газета. Just a brief descriptive statistics of our positional and reputational samples. The interesting thing here is we see that males unquestionably dominate both samples. Also, there are very few people who were born in 1930s and very few who were born in 1980s. The majority are Putin's own generation, 1950s, and the one that follows, 1960s. So what do we find? Here are the results for 2010 samples, both positional and reputational. You'll notice that the links to top nomenclatura are very few, 9 to 8%. But if we sum up middle, lower, and top nomenclatura samples, it gives us 74% in positional sample and 63% in reputational sample. For 2020, pretty much the same findings, except the total has decreased a little bit to 60%. But overall, we find up to 60% of top 100 Putin elites right now have a connection to nomenclatura, which I think is quite stellar. This is 30 years into transition, right? There's actually not so much rotation of the elites that we've been waiting for happening. Now, is 60 a lot or not a lot? How do we estimate this number? So, for comparison, we actually looked at the Siloviki share. We use the approach that Rivera and Rivera used, essentially looking at active duty officers and Silovik civilians in Putin elites, same samples. And here's what you find. We see that a total of Silovikis constitutes approximately 30% in 2010 sample, and slightly above that, approximately 35% in 2020 sample. So 60% nomenclatura, approximately 30-35% Siloviki, which tells you something about that, of the composition of Putin elites. A very interesting finding is that Siloviki and nomenclatura only overlap to 20-30%. So in a lot of ways, what you see here is that you have largely a regime, the elite that continues without much rotation from the Soviet times, and where some alternation of elite occurs, it happens primarily through the people with security backgrounds. Effectively, you have a mixture of people with like nomenclature links and security service backgrounds in power of Russia, which I think explains a lot what's going on. Our findings on Siloviki is also comparable to what has been found in previous studies before. Last but not the least, what do we make out of it? Very quickly, re-autocratization parties that we currently observe in the Russian society can be linked to the fact that the rotation of the elites have really never occurred. Looking back 30 years in, we can really look at the dynamic of the revolution that unraveled in Russia as a revolt of the lower ranks of nomenclatura against the top ones, because essentially the top blocked any recruitment channels for the lower ranks, but not fundamental rotation, not fundamental replacement of the elites. We still see a very strong lasting legacy. The lack of elite split as a result of the sanctions may also have to do with this effect, because discipline and loyalty were the key elements for the nomenclatura. You should wrap up. Yeah. Thank you very much. That's all I got.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those four very interesting and enlightening presentations. We have, it's not as great of a setup in this room, and so we have this microphone here, and that's it. We have a small audience, so if you're willing to come up and ask your question here, that would be lovely. If you would not prefer to do that, I can repeat the question into here so people on Zoom can hear it. But I would suggest that we collect several questions and then turn back to our panelists. Also, I like your sticker a lot. Yes, would you like to come up? Yeah, you're right here. It's a small audience, so I think actually that's not.
Why not? Hello, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Nadek Sesovyan. I'm a PhD student at Virginia Tech. School of Public and International Affairs. I have a pretty simple question for the first speaker about Cossack identity. I know there's been a lot of discussion about this. Maybe it's something everybody in this room already knows, but I'd be curious to hear about that ethno-national versus social military and how conceptualizations of Kazakhstan have developed, especially in very recent times. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Would anyone else like to come up to ask a question? Yes, please.
My questions are pretty simple also, but Maria, could you give some examples of positions for the top level nomenklatura who had to go through this, and then the very bottom level, so we can kind of get an idea on what where these people fell in the Communist Party regime? And if I could you talk? And this is getting back to this question, but to get into the high schools, do you have to be a Cossack national? Do you know if that's the case or not? Those are the...
Great, thank you. And so I see two more questions if you'd like to come up, and then you could come up to the mic as well. And then after 4 questions, I think we'll turn back to the panelists.
Well, thank you, really interesting presentation. I also had a question for Maria. So in this decade, I guess there's going to be more people from like the 70s and 80s who are like socialized in Russian Federation rather than Soviet Union. So I was just curious, like, I know it's probably like a small sample, but like from the younger people who are now entering that, is there a similar pattern, or do you think it's more, still those who have sort of parents who have this experience with Nomenklatura? And maybe like a really quick question to Richard as well. You said that the Cossacks, like some of them are slightly annoyed about this kind of centralization. I just wondered what the nature of that is. I mean, I'm not presuming that maybe they're anti, war in Ukraine, but is there some sense that, this might be important like down the line? So thank you.
Thank you. Yes, and we'll take one more question, and then we'll turn to our panelists.
Hi, my professor, he actually asked a similar question to what I wanted to ask. This relates to Maria more. I wanted to ask if the panelists think that perhaps will the Russian youth if they will follow in the steps of their parents, are there going to be the carbon copy? Will they just tell the Russian public to eat dirt and enjoy Italian luxury villas, or are they still going to be different because they grew up in the era of the internet? They're much more integrated, even if they're still going to enact repressive policies. Thank you.
Great, thank you for those interesting questions. Would one of our panelists like to start by coming up to answer some of them? Maria?
Thank you. If you don't mind, can I quickly show a slide which shows the examples of the... thank you. That's the question, first of all, regarding the positions that we found. And here, for example, the example of value 2, the top level of nomenklatura, here we have Veniamin Yakovlev, who held the position of the Minister of Justice, Viktor Zubkov, who was the first deputy chairman of the Leningrad Regional Executive Committee. So it's not like top Politburo, but it's high enough in the rank. This is as opposed to like lower ranking managerial positions in the Soviet system that still required approval of CPSU or similar bodies, such as Michael Trenoga, who was a senior engineer, deputy head of the Department of the Gas Industry Ministry of the USSR, Vladimir Yevtushenkov, who was the head of the Science and Technology Department of the Moscow City Executive Committee. So I hope it gets a little bit of an idea, like the very top ministerial positions versus slightly lower level, still managerial positions in this system. The second question, if we see the similar patterns among the younger people, excellent question. So maybe this is one way for us to extend this. Unfortunately, in our samples, the ones who belong to 70s and 80s, if you look at this descriptive statistics, first of all, there are relatively few of them. Second of all, the younger the people are, the harder it is to find information, interestingly enough. And over the years, the elites have become increasingly closed off. That's one reason why I collaborated with Kirill Petrov who is from Minchenko groups, and they have some extra information to dig out. And it's harder to find information about them themselves, and even their parental backgrounds are extremely hard to find. However, based on what we see right now, for example, Lisa Peskova or daughter of Mashkov, the Russian actor, speaking up, those who grew up in the West in particular, speaking up against the war. I think that Lisa has a little bit of hope that the individuals who've been socialized in a slightly different system will be at least less complacent with autocracy and less likely to essentially collaborate with these horrible things that the regime is doing. I think the key thing here, by the way, is not necessarily even, not necessarily even the re-autocratization, support of all these old ideas of autocracy, but elite complacency. With the discipline and loyalty that are the key element, that were the key elements of nomenklatura, and we see this dynamic across all of the post-Soviet space. Everywhere where the regime the elite rotation has not occurred to a large extent, we see the reemergence of the same autocratization patterns. Unfortunately, in this sense, Russia is not an outlier. It's quite a typical dynamic for all of the region. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Richard?
So thank you for your questions. We're talking about the idea of a Cossack national. I did want to stress that this is something the Russian government has discouraged people from identifying as on the census. I forget the year of the census, but the first census in the post-Soviet Russia saw 500, I think it was 500,000 Cossacks in Rostov, or roughly 10% of the population. That number diminishes rapidly, and it's because of the elimination of the category of Cossack. There's a song by a pop group, I guess it's a rap group, which encourages people to enter their nationality as Cossack in the 2012 census. So there is some contestation over this idea, and that relates to the question of whether you have to be a Cossack national to get into high school. No, absolutely not. It's open. It's to get into these cadet corps. No, it's absolutely not. That's, at least based on my understanding of it, that's not the case. And I did want to mention there are Cossack high schools, and they're fewer in number, but they do exist. There's even Cossack universities being opened right now, and there's the one in Rostov. I think it's named for Platov, and it's unclear as to what the significance of attending a Cossack university is, other than it has a Cossack cadet corps affiliated with it. But nevertheless, the name is given. On the dimension, the definition of Cossack and the struggle over Kazakhstan, yeah, there's this debate in Russia about whether Cossacks are seen as a military estate or whether they're seen as an ethnic group, or as the Russian state would prefer them to see themselves, as a sub-ethnic group of the Russian great ethnos. And so there are contestations over this. I've seen debates where people have been critical of each other, saying, you know, if all it takes to become a Cossack is to put on a hat and adopt a walk, channeling Monty Python, you know, it doesn't mean very much. And then there are other people who say, well, actually, it means more if you do service for the state. It doesn't mean so much if you just claim your ethnicity is Cossack. So there is a debate there. Cossacks slightly annoyed. I referred to that. I referred to that debate. Cossacks are instinctively patriotic. All of them, the Free Cossacks and the registered Cossacks, are all. They would all claim to be patriotic, and they wouldn't have opposition to Russia. I've seen a lot of. I've talked with a number of Free Cossacks who don't identify as registered Cossacks, but nonetheless they are supportive of Russia. They just don't see why the movement has to be taken over. And I think the last question about youth is a really interesting one, because I see one of the main tasks of this Cossack movement as being to socialize youth, to get you. And in the battle of ideas, this is a powerful front, right? This is where youth are being molded and taught the values that they ought to follow, and being given the inspirational stories that are going to make them, you know, to good patriotic citizens.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to weigh in before we go to more questions? Okay. So we had a comment, a few on Zoom. One from Bob Otto for Maria. How, if at all, does your study change an understanding of the Yeltsin period as one of progress toward democracy? And another question, it was about sharing I think we didn't share your slides on Zoom when you pulled them up. Someone was asking to share the slides. We'll try to do that if we pull those up again. So we have that one question from Maria, changing understanding of the Yeltsin period as one of progress towards democracy. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Good. Who would like to come up to the microphone? If you really don't want to, I can repeat your question, but it would be lovely if you would speak into the microphone.
Maria, about what the complacency past the Nomenklatura means for eventual divisions of the electoral, obviously what that means for it.
Great, thank you. And yes, please. You're welcome to kind of line up if that's easier. I know it's formal, but it's the system we have.
Just quickly for Kirill, to talk about scattered norms and sort of how we got to where we are, or that's how you describe it. For Gulnaz, it adds more color to the sort of local level interaction between individual citizens and their religious authorities. And interested to hear you talk about that more. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just have a question for Gulnaz, and I was wondering whether official Islam, in the sense of, so you spoke of these connections between the state and the religious leaders and these continuous discussions between these two levels, and whether these kind of connections between the state and religion gives to religious leader enough legitimacy to support the vaccination, the vaccination system. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yes, we'll take one more question and then we'll respond.
My question goes to Gulnaz also. I like really how you approach the sort of vaccination question in Norwegian. And so do you see any sort of interconnections between the past religious state in relations and the current? I mean, the sort of how did the state use the religion in the Soviet past and how it uses it now? And do you see any sort of interconnections between the usage of Muslim religion and Orthodox Christians during COVID and vaccination program?
Great, thank you for those questions. And would maybe either Kirill or Gulnaz would like to start this time with their responses?
So the other norms that I mentioned, apart from loss of confidence. So first of all, legislative initiative for prosecutors. So some analysts saw this as invasion of coercive vertical into legislative affairs on the regional level in Russia. However, in fact, 82 of Russian regions already granted prosecutors with the right to participate as actors with votes, as legislative actors. So what this law does, it actually makes it impossible to revoke this right, by the regions. So so we saw this norm scattered around regional laws. Now it's uplifted to the federal law. So the second, need for approval of regional ministers by federal ministers. So again, in 2020, all regional ministers of finance needed to pass the test of qualifications in the Federal Ministry of Finance already. And as we see from media, there are news that, well, the, let's say, health care minister of Krasnoyarsk Krai was approved by the, Minister of Healthcare of the Russian Federation. Although it may be, underpinned in the bylaws of the Krasnoyarsk region, but let's say in another region we can't find this type of norm, right? So, and this maybe that was a kind of bureaucratic etiquette. so informal practices that now is purely formalized and can be discretionary, because it's difficult to imagine that, let's say, Minister of Healthcare would be monitoring the cadre pool of all regions when the rotation of governors going on, and he or she need to find new healthcare minister. That's difficult. That's emergency measure that can be implemented in case of emergency, but probably that would work as it was earlier. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yes, so let me just add a bit of color as the first question went in terms of what I heard from people who I spoke to. Especially, let me describe just sort of my sense I received from how I saw the reactions of representatives of authority figures in Tatarstan. And I guess my first observation was that I saw a degree of cautious attitudes towards vaccination and a lot of rationalizations for that cautious attitude. So people who I spoke to, and this was Rafik Muhammedshan, there was also the Hadi, Tatarstan Hadi, who is a Sudiyat, the court, Sharia court leader. And they all shared these cautious attitudes. And when I was inquiring into why they're not taking a public position in terms of spreading knowledge that vaccination is safe, they were all expressing caution and basically saying that they cannot promise or guarantee, that doctors themselves do not give 100% guarantee about the effectiveness and about the absence of long-term, potential long-term side effects. So in a way, vis-a-vis me as an interviewer and people who they interact with in everyday life, they were taking a responsible position, but rationalizing their skepticism. So, and when the discussion went onto the official process of certification of the halalness of the vaccine, on the one hand, they were accepting the necessity, even if there are components of the vaccine that go against halal or kosher, they would, the religions allow enough flexibility in the situation of threat to life to go. So they use that justification, but also they criticize. So Tatarstan leaders, religious leaders, were criticizing the decisions that were taken in Moscow, in Duma, the spiritual board of Russian Federation, where decisions were made to certify, official halalness. So they were, on the one hand, expressing sort of understanding that vaccination is necessary. They wouldn't publicly promote it, and they were critical of official pronouncements of the halalness as being a bit, how should I put it, done under the pressure of the state and not quite true to knowledge, right? So there was a rather nuanced position that they were taking, and one rationale for this is that they are, and this is linked to the second question about the legitimacy, right? They are trying to maintain their relationships with the followers. They're trying to maintain the legitimacy. They realize very well that if they look in front of the public as promoting the message that's not resonant with the public, that is associated with the top levels of government, and that really reveal the government dominance, right? And that government dominance is read through very easily, and to avoid the discrediting of religious authorities, they prefer not to publicize, not to publicly advance the vaccination cause. So in a way, again, it's an attempt to maintain their legitimacy and their non-state, religious authority vis-a-vis the public. That stands. And then the last question, actually there are two more questions. I wouldn't be able to answer with regard to the Turkish government help to Tatarstan on COVID. I could only suggest that it's a good question to look into, because Tatarstani government, in terms of its foreign relations, and I'm speaking from my experience of working in the Department of Foreign Affairs in Tatarstan in the 90s, indeed has very close relationship with Turkish consulate and with Turkish government in general. So I wouldn't be surprised if there were some initiative of collaboration on this issue, on the issue of pandemic. And with regard to the past, I wouldn't be able to speak about the Soviet past. As I said, for me, this topic is actually, I'm coming from outside, not with the great expertise on the evolution of Islam in Tatarstan. But I would note that over the last 30 years, we do see a growing control of the state and the government over the religious authorities in terms of who are picked as these at specific positions. And this trend took its place from at least 1998 Congress, where the government took a rather heavy hand in terms of determining which of the spiritual boards will be, will stay. There were several spiritual boards represented in the 90s. So from pluralism, from more independent religious authority that was disconnected from the state and government, we saw a process of a stronger, heavy-handed control of religion in Tatarstan, also following the threats of terrorism and the very strong influence from security services and Moscow internal affairs services entering into the picture and making the government sort of the predominant force and establishing a very hierarchical relationships, which is one of the arguments for me to suggest why there is the equality in which a more collaborative effort could be made with the government seeking support from non-state actors, in this case religious actors, to promote the public health goals. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have just a little bit of time left, about 15 minutes, and I think we've gotten the questions that are in the Zoom here.
There's one more. There's one more.
Oh, I think Gulnaz just answered that. Let me look.
Maria.
There was from Maria. Oh, yes. Do you want to come up and answer that? Yeah. Thank you.
So, to answer Bob's other question, thank you.
Oh, and if you can share the slides on Zoom, that would be great if you're going to put a slide up.
I didn't know how to do it.
Go back to the, oh, here we go.
Oh, like demonstration.
Yeah.
Awesome, thank you very much. I think it's the key question for me. Somebody who was growing up in Russia in the 1990s, it was a big shock to sort of rethink this period, partly based on our studies results, not in a way of the democratic popular revolution, rejecting the old government and imposing a new one, but rather the lower ranks of Nomenklatura, led by Boris Yeltsin, among others, who himself sort of was a Nomenklatura person, although probably from the higher ranks. He sort of rebelling against the old elite groups who were resistant to implement change. So in a lot of ways, I think that's a function of the lack of true popular movement in Russia, not in the sense that it happened in Poland, not in the sense that it happened in the Baltics. There were some beginnings of this movement, but overall, and here I recommend also Kirill Rogov's publication on it, Russian society was deeply divided as to its choices, and it remains divided until now. We pretty much see the war in Ukraine demonstrating sort of ultimate manifestation of this divide, where pro-Western liberalizing movements still constitute a minority, and they were a minority at the time. So the 1990s, in a lot of ways, was the same old Soviet Leviathan state weakened. And as long as it was weakened, there was some shallow reforms possible, but they were never deep enough to really fundamentally change the track. And the moment once the Leviathan got strong again, partly thanks to the oil prices dynamic, unfortunately, we saw the return of the very same patterns. On the elite compliance, another great question. Thank you very much. I think the complacency and the fact that the elites still hold on to some of their ideas and behavior style of the Soviet times, I think it does put a limit to the extent that we can expect a split. You can already see where these little cracks do occur right now, right? They've happened primarily with the elites with more pro-Western orientations, so-called system liberals, which we sort of rejected that label. And I also thought it was no longer relevant, but still comes true that Nabiulina, Chubais, Arkady Barkovich, all classic system liberals who started speaking up against the war, also Friedman and Deripaska, the oligarchs with more pro-Western capital. So in a lot of ways, you see that this line does still go across these people who are united around them, whatever Putin does, and the more like different groups that don't have this track. So I think it does put a limit to the extent that you can expect the cracks in the systems. But ultimately, even in the Soviet Union, the cracks did happen after the elites experienced big enough misfortune. So ultimately, it's just the question of how much leverage the West is willing to impose on the Russian society, the Russian elites in particular. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we have just a few minutes left. I think we can take one or two more questions if there are any. Would anyone else in the audience here like to ask a question? We're going to do the PONARS first and the ending 5 minutes early. But yeah, thank you. If there's no other questions, thank you very much, everyone.